What I would like to, the second, is something that's familiar to all of you, but I would like to just sort of reframe it slightly. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, in Book 3 of Moreh Nevuchim, in the latter chapters, when he's introducing his description of Tamei Mitzvot, goes into an analysis of the question of whether it is the case that every mitzvah of the Torah has some human benefit in it. He explores that issue because obviously his antecedents explored that issue, right? I mean, Saadia Gaon, of course, had explored that issue a couple of hundred years earlier and reached the conclusion that, well, you know, there are some mitzvot that are rational and that are intended for human benefit, and those are the ones that we call mishpatim, and that on the other hand, there are laws of the Torah, there are mitzvot of the Torah that are not intended for human benefit, but that have, you know, purely to do with sort of people's connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that they're not rational, they are irrational. Right? It doesn't mean they're irrational, they're not against human reason, but they don't have a rational purpose, but they have some kind of a purpose in establishing human obedience to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And those are what we call chukim. The Rambam takes issue with that fundamental approach. The Rambam maintains that every one of the mitzvot of the Torah, whether they are be'enu l'chavero or be'enu l'makom, whatever other way you want to classify them, and by whatever name you want to call them, that every single mitzvah of the Torah has some form of human benefit. And then he goes on to explain, in broad terms at first, what those benefits are. And the Rambam is able to identify three sort of categories of benefit, of human benefit. So the first is to know what's true in the world. Right? That you know, you have to know what's true in the world. And therefore there are times that Torah has to tell you what is true in the world so that you'll know. Because if you don't know what's true in the world, you can often be misled into thinking, you know, that things that are false are really true. And if you believe things that are false, then your life will be governed by sheker instead of by emet, and then you will do all sorts of things, and you know you'll be filled with sheker in your head instead of emet. And so for that reason, says the Rambam, you know, the Torah has to tell us at the very, you know, outset, so to speak, that there's only one HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the universe, and that, you know, there are no other deities, right? There are no other deities, and by the same token, you know, similarly the Rambam points out that's why the Torah has to tell us that communication with the dead is asur. So why is communication with the dead asur? Says the Rambam. Well, communication with the dead is asur because human beings, living human beings, cannot communicate with dead human beings. I mean, it is true that a Navi may have a vision at some point of a communication, but that's not a reality of communication. That's just a vision in his head, right? But in terms of a reality of actual communication between a living person and a dead person, that's not possible. So why is it important for people to know that, says the Rambam? Because if you don't know that, then you are very vulnerable to exploitation. That is, if you don't know that, you know, somebody's going to tell you that in your sorrow about a loss, that you know, they can help you communicate with the person who's gone into the next world, and that will relieve your you know, your sorrow to a certain extent. Right, but what they're really after is not, you know, they're either after your money, or they're after your body, or they're after your obedience, or they're after something, right? I mean, because it's really sheker, and you have to know that in order to be protected, because otherwise you'll be exploited in that situation, right? So that's one whole category of forms of purposes of law has to do with this issue of truth, of knowing what's true. Then he says there's a second layer to this. The second layer to this has to do with midot, with personality qualities. Because, those are very subtle, and they're very difficult to sort of discern what is truly an essential midah that serves the purposes of goodness in the life of a person, and what are midot that are corrupted. And unless you know the difference, then it's very easily to be persuaded that you should do something that's really wrong. And therefore, there are many mitzvot of the Torah that address feelings, right? Because the feelings are the foundation of midot. I mean, it's they're not just logic; they're feelings. And Salvation used to point out that there are some 35 different mitzvot in the Torah that address matters of feeling. In most of those situations, when the Chachamim confront the question of what constitutes the kiyum ha-mitzvah, in most of those situations, the Chachamim maintain that the kiyum is behavioral, or the kiyum is in speech. In some form, right? The kiyum is either in an action or in speech or in some kind of manifestation, that it requires manifestation, right? So how are you mekayim, the mitzvah v'ahavta re'acha kamocha? V'ahavta re'acha kamocha, is the kiyum essentially the feeling of love, or is the kiyum ha-mitzvah actions which manifest love? And Chazal's dominant positions are that the kiyum ha-mitzvah is really in the action. But Rabbi Saul Berman used to say that doesn't mean that the inner feeling then becomes irrelevant. It is not the case that we should be satisfied with someone doing acts of chesed without feeling love toward the other person. Right? I mean, if the kiyum ha-mitzvah of v'ahavta re'acha kamocha is in gmilut chasadim, then we should not tell people that, well, as long as you send food to somebody's house, whether you love them or not, it doesn't matter. It matters. It's true you should send even if you don't have that feeling. Right? It's true you should send even if you don't have that feeling. But the inner component, the inner feeling, always has to be worked on. You have to attempt to achieve the inner feeling that is consonant with the outer behavior. There are a number of limited situations in which it's, so to speak, entirely the inner feeling that is being addressed. But those are rare. But in any case, so when it comes to midot, it's clear. I mean, that's why the Torah says lo tisna et achicha b'vavecha, right? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands that sinah is a powerful drive. And when sinah gets invested in the personality, it can destroy. It can be a deeply destructive feeling. Destructive to the person, destructive to the society, right? And that's why we have to work doubly hard to make sure that sinah does not become invested in us as a personality quality, right? Now, on the other hand, when the Torah commands us 3 separate times in the mitzvah of Ahava, it's precisely because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood about us, as our Creator understood about us, that Ahava opens us to goodness. That Ahava, whether it's in the form of Avas Hashem, or in Avat Yisrael, as in V'ahavta re'acha kamocha, or as in Avat Hager, in the form of right, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that He Himself is right, Ki Ohev Ger, right, and that right, you're all aware that the word Ger is used in 2 overlapping manners in the text of Torah. Sometimes it means a convert to Judaism, and sometimes it means a stranger, a resident alien, right, the Ger Toshav, and that it is extraordinarily difficult in the whole of the text of the Torah to isolate out those pieces in any way that's really demonstrably correct in the text of the Torah. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu had lots of words. He had lots of words. And there's no question that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to, he could have given us another word for either of those categories of persons, if he wanted them to be kept completely separate, right? But they're intentionally, clearly not kept completely separate, right? That's why the Ramban takes the Rambam to issue over the fact that the Rambam did not list Avat Hager in the sense of Ava of the Ger Toshav as a separate mitzvah d'oraita. Right? The Rambam does not list it as a separate mitzvah d'oraita. Despite the fact that the Ramban adds it in the Husaf, in the Ramban's Husafot. He in his Perush, he criticizes the Rambam for this, and then in the Husafot, he adds it from his perspective. A separate mitzvah d'oraisa is Ava toward Ger Toshav, which means someone who accepts Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach and who's willing to submit to the authority of Jewish, entity. Right? There's a separate mitzvah d'oraita of Avat Hager, and the Megillat Esther in his defense of the Rambam, right? Well, what's his defense of the Rambam? His defense of the Rambam is not that there is no such mitzvah as Avat Hager in the sense of the Ger Toshav. His defense of the Rambam is that it's already nichlal, it's already included in the mitzvah of tzedakah. And since tzedakah encompasses also the Ger Toshav, then that means that the Ava is also encompassed in that, right? And that's why there's a duty of rescue, he maintains. That's why that's why the Ramban maintains it. That's why the Rambam also maintains that there's a duty of rescue of life in relation to Ger Toshav, right? And that Ger, or in any case, it's a whole other issue. But the point is that Kadosh Baruch Hu understands that Ava is a powerful emotion, and it has the capacity to produce enormous good. And that therefore we have to work on this emotion. So we have to, avoid midot that are midot out, so to speak, and we have to, on the other hand, cultivate midot that are affirmative. That's the second layer of function of laws of the Torah. And then there's a third layer. The third layer of function of laws in the Torah, says the Rambam, is to generate a just society. Generate a just society. That is, to make sure that we create a society in which there is justice, right? I mean, how many times does the Torah tell us in Sefer Bereshit, offer us illustrations of societies that were unjust, and it's setting us up for this idea that we have to create a society, and the society we have to create, should not include midot of stone, right? That the society that we create should not encompass the midot even of Mitzrayim, right? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps telling us that later on, right? And he says, you should not follow the ways of Mitzrayim, right? And so these three layers for the Rambam serve, I believe, two separate purposes and need to be seen in two separate frameworks, but they overlap with each other. The first is that according to the Rambam, every single mitzvah of the Torah contains one or more of these functions that involve human benefit. But the sort of, if I were to draw a pyramid for you, the tip of the pyramid, the top of the pyramid, would contain the set of aspirations, the set of goals, of ultimate goals that we want to achieve in life. And those are the goals of achieving truth in our lives, of achieving midot, that are personality qualities, achieving a set of virtues that Hashem models for us, and of achieving a just social order, achieving a just society. So that's up at the peak. At the base of that are the mitzvot of the Torah, because the mitzvot of the Torah are not just aspirations, they are laws in which those aspirations are embedded but not perfectly achieved. What do I mean by that? Law is a limited instrument. The Rambam makes reference to this a number of different times. Law is a limited instrument in producing sort of the goals of a society. Why is it a limited instrument? So I'll look at two reasons briefly. One is, it's a limited instrument because there's no question that in terms of these aspirations, they often come into conflict with each other. And as we all learn, as we grow as moral people, we all learn that the really difficult moral decisions are not the decisions between good and bad. The really difficult moral decisions are when there are two goods that are in conflict with each other. Right? That's when we really, that's when we have moral conflicts. We shouldn't have moral conflicts about whether to steal something, whether to, right? But we have conflicts, but we do have a conflict when, there's somebody who's starving, and the only way we can get food for that person who's starving is by stealing it, whether we should steal it in order to give it to that person. So that's a situation where there's a conflict between goods, right? On one hand, you want to save somebody's life, save their health, whatever, and on the other hand, you don't want to steal, right? Because stealing is clearly socially injurious, and on the other hand, saving this, right? And that exists on every level in virtually every area of life. We often confront these conflicts. I mean, there's a mitzvah Shavat Avedah, right? So it's a unique law of the Torah. There's no other legal system in the history of humanity that has ever made it mandatory that if you see a piece of property lying on the side of the street that looks like it might be valuable, that you're obligated to pick it up and to attempt to identify the owner to return it to the owner. So, I mean, there are limited forms of that. I mean, in the United States, there are state laws that say that once you've picked up a wallet, for example, you see a wallet lying in the street, once you pick it up, you can't just drop it again, right? That you have a responsibility to put it into a mailbox or hand it to a police officer or give it to somebody who could, but you don't have a personal responsibility to begin with to pick it up.
גם בבבל, אבדה למלכות. אבדה למלכות. בגמרא.
Same thing, that's right.
אבדה למלכות.
Right. So the reality is that, you have this obligation to do it. So let me ask you a question. Is there a limit to that obligation?
Yeah, of course.
What do you mean, of course? The Torah doesn't say anything about a limit to the obligation.
זקן ואינו לפי כבודו.
Right, so right, Zaken ve'eno לפי כבודו, not obligated to do it. How about a limit in time? How about a limit in time? Is there a limit in time? So midoraita, it does not appear to be a limit in time. So what does that mean? So you go around, you'll pick up umbrellas because somebody lost them, and eventually every Jewish community in the world will have a pyramid devoted entirely to rescued umbrellas, right? You found this piece of property, it belongs to somebody, and therefore I'm going to hold on to it until that person comes, right? Said Chazal, no, it's impossible. Why is that impossible? It's impossible, first of all, because you know that if you tell people they're going to have to hold on to something, for eternity, nobody's going to pick up anything, right? That's a guarantee. Nobody's going to pick up anything. So it will produce the exact opposite result. And secondly, because there's also another value here, and that's the value of Bal Tashchit. I mean, if there is property and it's usable, we don't want it to forever have to be stored, because then it doesn't do any good for anybody. And that would be like Bal Tashchit, it would be wasteful in relation to property. And Chazal understand that even in the context of war, there's an issur of Bal Tashchit, let alone in other circumstances, right? That's only a model to teach us that everything that, according to the Rambam, seems reasonably clear, that according to the Rambam, the issur d'oraita of Bal Tashchit applies to everything, and at all times. So what's happened is, so what did Chazal do? So you have this famous case in the Gemara, said the Chachamim, it's impossible for there to be a limit, because we know this story about, I think it was Rav Chizda, Rav Chizda found a donkey wandering and he took the donkey in and he took care of the donkey and a year and a half later, somebody showed up and said to Chachamim, no, if you what? Egel with the Tanagol. Good. Okay, whatever it was. Okay. Okay, so the question was, so is there a limit to this? Said the Chachamim, there is a limit. The limit is what? 1 year cycle. So how you count the year cycle became a matter of debate. Right? But basically, a year cycle, even a year cycle, you attempted to to find the owner and you failed, and you can't give it back. So by the end of the year, the law will presume that what? That the Baal was miyayesh. And if the Baal was miyayesh, then it's davar hefker. And if it's davar shel hefker, then as long as you have it, you have possession of it, and if you intend to own it, that's how ownership is established, by possession and intent to own, right? So it doesn't belong to anybody else. So you can keep it. Says the Gemara, wait a second, but Rav Chizda didn't do that. I mean, he is a year and a half later, the person showed up and he gave it back. So the Gemara's answer was that Rav Chizda lifnim mishurat hadin hu da'avad. Right? So what does that mean, lifnim mishurat hadin hu da'avad? Lifnim mishurat hadin hu da'avad is part of a broad network of instances in which the Chachamim tell us that by law you're not obligated to do that, but we consider it to be something that you should consider doing because we think that it's virtuous to do it. But we're not going to tell you that la halacha you're required to do it, but it's the virtuous thing to do. And not everything that is in accordance with a midat tovah are you obligated to do. And the Talmud is filled with such expressions, right? I mean, you're all familiar with them. On both stadim, that is, times when something is patur mutar, something is you're not obligated to do it, but it's permissible to do, so you're permitted here, you're not obligated to give back the thing, you're entitled to keep it to yourself, it's permissible, and the Chachamim will come along and they'll say, but we think you should give it back. Be a nice thing, a good thing to do, right? Now, so that generally, that whole category of things, that's what Chazal mean when they speak about things being midat chasidut. That's what Chazal mean when they say, conversely, that something, if you do it, it's midat sdom. What does it mean it's midat sdom? Is it usr? That's the question. To which the answer is, no, it's not usr, but it's midat sdom. So that's a form of persuasion. Right? It's a form of persuasion. So what you have essentially is as follows. You have the top of this pyramid has the aspirations. Right? It has these the goals, the truths, the virtues, the social values that you're striving to achieve. The bottom layer is the halacha, whether it's d'oraita or d'rabanan, right? Even if it's minhag, if it's binding minhag, you have all of these things that the society says we will coerce you to do. Why? Because if we want to achieve those goals, then we need to have a base of common action on the part of all of the members of the society. Everybody has to agree that being a member of the society requires that I do this. And sometimes I don't want to do it, but I'm required to. And if you fail to do it, then the society will coerce you to do it. They'll punish you to do it. Or they'll fail to reward you if you just fail to do it, right? One way or another, there'll be consequences on the level of the society, because that's what it means to require people to do things. That's what law is about. Law is about requiring people to do things. But law is more than just requiring people to act. Law is also requiring people to aspire to try to achieve those goals. And there's a gap between what the law requires and the purity of the goals. And whether that disparity is created because there are goals that are in conflict with each other, or whether it's because practically you really can't expect everybody to be at that high level of moral existence and of knowledge of truth. So there's this middle area. The middle area essentially is the area of Reshut. But it's Reshut with counsel. It's Reshut with counsel. That is, where the halacha says, yes, this is your pater, but it's mutar. Right? You're not obligated to do it. It's permissible to do it. But nevertheless, we advise you. We think that this is something you ought to do. Not required to do by law, but which we think is valuable. You have to think about this, and you have to yourself make the decision whether to do it or not. Rav Chizda had to decide, and Rav Chizda could have decided differently. Rav Chizda could have decided that at that point in time his family was so poor that for him to give up this animal would have bankrupted his family, and that he has a prior responsibility for his family. So, you have to take into consideration the whole host of other factors, but you have to make that decision. All right? That's this middle realm that some people refer to as ethics, some people refer to as morality. Right? But it's all founded on the same understanding that the law, the Torah is attempting to achieve something for us, that there are goals that we aspire to, and that we know what those goals are. And that the law is an embodiment of those goals, that every single law of the Torah is a way of attempting to embody one or another, or sometimes multiple, of those kinds of elements, of knowing what's true in the world and avoiding that which is false, of knowing what is a true virtue and what is a false virtue, right, of knowing what is a social value and what is destructive for the society within which we live. That's what the whole of the Torah is designed, and that's the sense in which the Rambam means that every law in the system, is designed. So the Rambam is willing to make a slight exception. His slight exception is that there are certain rules that only serve administrative purpose. Like, for example, says the Rambam, how many times you sprinkle the dam on the mizbeach, and where on the mizbeach you sprinkle it, he said those may be just like administrative decisions, because you want to be able to distinguish between the different types of karbanot. You want people to understand that the karban olah means that you are offering some praise of Hashem, that the karban chatat or renasham means that you are doing the process of doing tshuva for something that went wrong in your life, and that the karban shlamim has to do with your attempting to offer gratitude to Hashem for what you have, even though you need all of that other stuff, right? That every karban has a slightly different purpose. If you want to indicate that every korban has a slightly different purpose, then you need to distinguish one kind of korban from another. Whether it's a different animal that's offered, or it's the same animal, but one has to be slaughtered, at this time, or this has to be slaughtered at a different time, or this one you sprinkle the blood here, and the other one you sprinkle the blood here. So those are administrative decisions, says the Rambam, right? So I mean that's where Samson Raphael Hirsch, for example, Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch parted ways with the Rambam on this matter, right? So Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch said, no, even those. Sometimes, but not quite as uniformly as Samson Raphael Hirsch, right? So he is an extreme, right? Even where the number of times that you sprinkle the blood makes a difference. There's some kind of symbolic meaning embedded in that. The Rambam is not willing to go that far. The Rambam is willing to recognize that there are they're administrative. They serve a purpose, but the purpose is not a conceptual purpose. It's just a way of seeing to it that the broader purpose of the korban is achieved, right? So for the Rambam, it's clear that the whole system is designed this way, and what I would like to describe that as is a second layer that needs to be recognized that we don't often focus on, and that is what this really has to do for the Rambam is it makes the law into a mechanism of imparting meaning in life. The reality is that for most human beings, for most intelligent human beings, there's a search for meaning. A search for meaning. People have to be able to feel that their lives are meaningful, that their lives embody some purpose beyond just themselves. And in a sense, what the Rambam has done in this scheme is to design a way of understanding what the layers of meaning, the layers of potential meaning in people's lives are, and how it is that the Torah attempts to enable people to achieve meaning in life. Right? That there's meaning in knowing what's true in the world. Right? That life, for some people, that's all there is, right? There are some people who, who are scientists whose entire meaning in life is devoted just to understanding the truth of the universe, right? What's true in the universe and what's false, right? So, on a certain level, there are people who do Torah Lishma that way. There are people who do Torah Lishma not for any human purpose even, but just for the sense of meaning that is derived from knowing what is true. Because if Torah is emet, then knowing what is emet is an ultimate value. And on the other hand, there are other people for whom, it's clear that it's the inner life that yields meaning. It's the life of virtues that yields meaning. The knowledge that one is acting in a way that is good, in a way that is imitative of the midot of Hashem. Right? So if Hashem tells us that He is Hashem, Keil, Rachum, Chanun, Erech Apayim, Rav Chesed, Emet, right? The 13 midot of Hashem, they're not accidentally called midot. They're not, obviously, not the names of Hashem. Right? If we have just spent the last, month and a half over and over again from Slichot through all of the rest of the Tfilot and then even on the Moed of still reciting Hashem, Keil, Rachum, Chanun, it's not because these are God's names. It's because these are God's virtues, right? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sort of organized them for us even. I mean, the first three are fundamentally virtues in God's productive relationship to the world, right? The first Hashem is sort of the representation of just God's productivity. God produced the world, right? The second Hashem is representation of God's entry into partnership with humanity to achieve His purposes for the material world, right? And the third, Keil, is the manifestation of God's power, God's exercise of power for goodness in the world, right? And then it shifts from those elements of we identify more broadly as the midot of chesed in interpersonal relationships, right? Of Rachum and Chanun and Erech Apayim and Rav Chesed and Emet and Notzeh Chesed La'alafim, right? Moving through all of these forms of kindness and goodness and in different forms. That each one of them has a slightly different meaning and ending with Notzeh Chesed La'alafim, which is really the ultimate midah of gratitude, right? Midah of gratitude. So that culminates those six. And then you have the four most difficult midot ever to achieve in the imitation of Hashem, right? And those are the midot of forgiveness, right? Nosei avon, v'fesha, v'chata'a, v'nakeh. That Hashem that He can tolerate, right? That He has the patience, that He has the qualities of, that He has the humility, that He has these various qualities that make it possible for Him to tolerate and to forgive ultimately, and even ultimately to allow atonement for all sorts of evil, in the world. Those are the most difficult of the midot of Hashem but so what does it mean even when Chazal said that what Hashem said to Moshe was, whenever in the future Am Yisrael has sinned, they should appear before me, they should recite the 13 midot. What's the big deal of reciting the 13 midot? What's the big deal about reciting the 13? Is there some magical effect that can be achieved by reciting those names? No, it's because if we recite the 13 midot with understanding of what they are, then what we're saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is we understand who He wants us to be. Because what that really is telling HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that we're on a path of tshuva. That we're in a process of evaluation of who we are, of how we use our power in the world, of how we use ourselves in the world of relationships to other persons, of how we express gratitude and how we try to achieve some kind of forgiveness to others despite the evil that they've engaged in. Right? So if we appear before Hashem and we tell Him we know what our aspirations are, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, then I know that they'll be on the right path, and I'll forgive them and let them keep working on it. Right? But it presumes that we have an understanding of what those aspirations are. So this whole system, it seems to me, is a mechanism for enabling the possibility of meaning. So I was struck by it again. This Friday morning was Rosh Chodesh. So I was in shul on Friday morning, and the Gabbai asked me if I wanted to daven for the Yamid, and I said no. So I usually say no. I mean, I happen to love Psukei de Zimra. I think Psukei de Zimra is just quite extraordinary. I don't think that any of these additional tefillot that we've added over the course of this time, tefillot for this and tefillot for that and tefillot for that and another tefillot for that, I think most of them are already there, right there in the Tehillim that we recite in Psukei de Zimra, if not even before in the Parshat of the Karbanot, which teach us how to prepare for Tefillah. I mean, the Siddur has extraordinary power of its own. In any case, so I love Psukei de Zimra, and usually I accept the invitation of Psukei de Zimra, but when I know that the community is going to be in a rush, like on a Rosh Chodesh, on a weekday morning, I know that if I get up to daven, people will be very upset with me by the time they get out. So I said no. So he said, so I said, you have somebody else? So I said, no, it's going to have to be me. So I said, okay, so, it'd be a pleasure to hear you. So he said, yeah, but I was supposed to learn the Mishnah, at the end of davening. So if you learn the Mishnah, I'll daven for the Yamid. So I said, where are you up to? I didn't, So he told me it's in Perek Vav of Bava Basra, the third Mishnah. So I said, okay, let me take a look at it. He had a Mishnah there. So I said, okay, I'll say it, Zar Torah. So whatever I'll do, I'll teach. So worst comes to worst, I'll just, talk the Mishnah. So what is that Mishnah about? It turns out, so the Mishnah is about the following. What happens if a man dies and he leaves the Yerusha? His Yerusha is then inherited by his sons. He has multiple sons. And one or more of the sons, since it's in the middle of the harvest season, and that's the unstated premise of the Mishnah, so they can't divide up the property in the middle of the harvest season, right? I mean, they're busy, right? So one or more of the sons says, listen, I'll assume responsibility for seeing to it that the work that needs to be done will still be done. In fact, I think that there are ways in which I can even produce a greater profit for us. I'll do that. So he undertakes it, and he does it. And then and he in fact succeeds, and there's a large profit. And the question that arises, is that profit belong to him, or does the profit become part of the Yerusha? So there's a second case that the Mishnah names, which is the same thing in case of women who inherit. If a group of women inherit, a group of sisters inherit, the same inherit, whatever, it's inherited from. It says the Gemara has a strange way of working out what the case is, but that's it. Okay? So I taught this halacha, and then I said, but and what the Mishnah says is that if he has not at the outset, if he did not at the outset say, I will do this for my own profit, then all the profit is to be shared with everybody. if he says at the outset he'll do this, but he's going to take the profit for himself, he's entitled to do that. So I raised the following question. I said, isn't this contrary to a fundamental principle in the halacha, stated often in the Bavas, and that is that if someone enters into somebody else's property and benefits their property without the permission of the owner, that the halacha is that what? That yado al tachtona. So what does yado al tachtona mean? Yado al tachtona means that he is entitled to be paid for his services, but he's not entitled to keep all of the profit, right? But he is entitled to take what the least amount of expense the owner would have had to go to in order to produce that profit. So, but wait a second. Here, this Mishnah doesn't say that. This Mishnah says that if one of the brothers decided to benefit the property, that he doesn't get anything, unless what?
Wasn't that lelo reshut, the second one that you cited?
Well, this one also was without the reshut of the father. He just went and he did it. The father was dead already, and he just went and he did it. This is what he did to the property. He did not say that he wants it for himself. He could have said he wants it for himself, and then it would have belonged to him, but he didn't. So why isn't that inconsistent with the principle of Yerdal Reshut Chaveru Sholu Reshut? So what I said was as follows. I think that the halacha is different within the context of a family. That is, within the context of a family, if someone says that they're going to do something to benefit the family, then the law presumes that his intention was to benefit the entire family, not only himself. A person has the right, even within the context of the family, to say that he's going to do this, but he can only do it if he gets paid to do it. But otherwise, if he doesn't say that, the presumption in the family is that if you're doing something in the benefit of the family, it's really for the benefit of the family, not for yourself. As opposed to people who are not part of family, people who are not family, where, you do something that benefits another person, you're entitled to be a beneficiary of that. Maybe a lesser beneficiary than you would otherwise have wanted. But if you didn't get permission to do it, then you're still entitled to benefit because you offered benefit to somebody else. So I said that I think that this halacha is attempting to teach us something very fundamental about presumptions, about what we need, what expectation we should have of ourselves. And that expectation is different in the context of the relationship to the family than in the relationship to the outside world. That in the relationship to the family, if we undertake to do something, unless we've worked out in advance and gotten their consent, so to speak, to benefiting from this for only ourselves, or benefiting more to ourselves than anybody else. But if we haven't done that, then we presume that you've acted, and that's our presumption. That's what we want people to understand that. And so that's why the Mishnah has to specifically teach that here. This is different from the general law of So what I think is that, the whole of the process of Torah is an attempt to empower us to cultivate a sense of meaning in our lives. And that meaning is transmitted through law, but law is not the only instrument through which it's transmitted. And for us as Rabbanim, as Machanchim, the understanding that what we're really doing is, in the teaching of Torah, in all of its dimensions, is enabling people to have a sense of meaning in their lives, a sense of meaning in their connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a sense of meaning in truth, which is represented by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a sense of meaning in their relationship to themselves and their own inner lives, and a sense of meaning in their relationship to others and the society within which they live, that's what we're empowering people to achieve that. And it takes some complexity sometimes to work out the particular meanings, and it's much easier to just give people a list of rules. It's much easier to just give people a list of rules. This is what you have to do. But I don't think that that's an educative process. I think the process of education requires that we give people the opportunity to understand the purposes for the rules, even in its details. So yes, there are points where I would agree with the Rambam, where there are certain details that are administered, but people then need to understand that. And they need to understand why those administrative details are necessary. But that fundamentally in the teaching of Torah, that we have to be able to convey the instruments through which people will achieve meaning, the deepest possible meaning in their lives.
Thank you very, very much.
I'm finished.
No, I just imagine people may have some questions, and we have to be out of here in 10 minutes. So
we have to leave in what?
We have to be on the road in 10 minutes.
We have to be on the road in 10 minutes.
I'm just conscious of but I want to give, if you have any concluding thing you want to say still, or questions for people, and I'm happy to set up a time to do a follow-up Zoom with you once people are back in Israel.
That's all right. Okay, so if there are any questions, I'll be glad to respond to questions, either in the first part or in this part, whatever you think. Yes?
There's a concept I know in Chabad philosophy and other places that when a person really thinks about it, there's only chiyuv and isser. There's no tchum of reshut. Or maybe as a person rises higher in the moral understanding, you actually get to a point where you either have obligation or forbiddenness, and reshut disappears. So I don't know.
Yeah. So I disagree completely with that approach. Mm-hmm. Why do I disagree completely with that approach? Because I think that the assumption that everything is either chiyuv or isser would make us ultimately into automatons, just creatures of obedience. And I don't think that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us free will. I think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want us to become automatons. Didn't want everything to be either yes or no, or asur or chayav, because then he wouldn't have had to give us free will. He could have given us a Kitzur Chonarch to begin with and saved us all this trouble. Could have revealed on Sinai, could have given us, or Rav Avadia's psakim for everything that exists in the universe, right? And we would have all the rules, and we would be done with it. I think the nature of human existence is that we are constantly confronted by new situations, new issues, new awarenesses. And unless we have an understanding of the principles, the moral principles, and what it is we're trying to achieve in our lives, and unless we then develop the capacity to weigh those virtues and values against each other, and unless we learn how to make decisions by ourselves, then we reduce our competence as human beings. And I think what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to do in this entire system is to empower us to make responsible moral decisions. And therefore I think the realm of Reshus needs to be protected. The realm of Reshus needs to be protected. We should not automatically say, well, if the Chachamim said that this is Midat Sdom, then, obviously you should not do it. And obviously you should not be considered a frum person if you do that. No, there are a variety of circumstances that people have to evaluate in the context of their own lives, whether they're going to do that or not. And I know Midat Sdom is an extreme example. But on the other hand, when we look at issues like, Midat Chasidut, and we look at Ein Ruach Chachamim Nocha Himeno as opposed to Ruach Chachamim Nocha Himeno, we look at Midat Chasidut as opposed to, non-Chasidut, it seems to me that we need to protect those, not because the choice should be made any way you want to, and not because the choice should be made by what will give me the greatest momentary pleasure, and that would be the answer to all of the questions, meaning that everything would be mutter unless it's asur, right? What it means, though, is that we have to train people to think seriously about how they assume responsibility for moral decisions. And that means that Chazal have modeled that for us by telling us this is not asur. But it's in ruach chachamim noichei himenu. So figure out why the chachamim were not happy with that, and then decide whether in this particular situation you should do that or you shouldn't do that. Right? This is, you're not chayev in this, but the chachamim said, but chachamim told us that this is this is one of the midot of Avraham Avinu, and even though it's not halachically required, think about that. So what does that mean in your life? And shouldn't you be aspiring to be doing that? So I understand where this. I think that many chachamim and many even great Jewish philosophers had such a distrust of people's material desires that they thought that any temptation, whether it be a material pleasure or some other material benefit, would override any of these kinds of moral considerations. I don't think that's true. And I certainly don't think that we should consider Am Yisrael to be that way. I don't think that Am Yisrael. I think Am Yisrael, we are, we are Bnei Avraham Avinu, right? I mean, we have an enormous amount of chesed built into us. I mean, I look with astonishment, and I come back to it at the end. I mean, I look with astonishment at the extraordinary degrees of chesed that have been manifested in Eretz Yisrael during this period of time, during this period of crisis. It's just like unlimited chesed has been unleashed in the society. If only we could keep it that way. I fear for what happens when peace comes and people sort of lose that sense of mutuality and of sharing and of responsibility. But that we should not aspire to be a society in which it's all automatic. We should aspire to be a society in which people are thoughtful and decide to be good in the maximum possible way.